For nearly 80 years, the Sindhi people have carried a wound that never fully closed. When partition tore through the subcontinent in 1947, it didn't simply redraw a map. It uprooted an entire homeland. Hundreds of thousands of Sindhi Hindus fled the province of Sindh, now part of Pakistan, crossing into an India they had never lived in, carrying only what they could hold, leaving behind homes, temples, and a land their families had called their own for thousands of years. Those who stayed became part of Pakistan's Muslim Sindhi population. Those who left rebuilt entire communities from nothing, scattered across Indian cities like Ahmedabad, Mumbai, and Ulhasnagar, determined never to let their identity disappear. Unlike Punjab, unlike Bengal, unlike Kashmir, regions that at least retained a namesake province or state on both sides of the new border, Sindh became something rarer and more painful in the story of partition. The overwhelming majority of its Hindu population left almost entirely, transforming an ancient, rooted community into something closer to a true diaspora, a people connected to a specific ancestral homeland they could describe in exquisite detail through food, language, and prayer, but which most of them, and eventually all of them, would never physically see again. For 78 years, two Sindhi communities have lived on opposite sides of a border neither chose, separated by nationality, by religion in many cases, and by the sheer weight of a shared trauma that history books rarely give the space it deserves. Then, scientists opened the DNA. For the first time, researchers conducted a comprehensive genome-wide study comparing Sindhi populations living in India against Sindhi populations still living in Pakistan, a direct, side-by-side genetic comparison of a single ethnic community split by one of history's most violent border drawings. The question was simple. After nearly 8 decades of separation, after different citizenships, different neighbors, and in many cases different religious practices, would the DNA still tell the story of one person or two? The answer, when it finally came back, left researchers with a result they described as genuinely striking. Because despite everything partition took from them, despite 80 years of separation across a hostile international border, Sindhis in India and Sindhis in Pakistan turned out to still be, at the genetic level, remarkably and unmistakably the same people. This is the story of what scientists found when they finally compared Sindhi DNA on both sides of the India-Pakistan border. To understand why this study mattered so much, you first need to understand who the Sindhi people actually are, and just how deep their roots in this particular stretch of land actually run. Sindh, the province that gives the Sindhi people their name, sits along the lower reaches of the Indus River in what is now southeastern Pakistan. And it is not simply another regional identity among South Asia's many ethnic groups. Sindh is, quite literally, ground zero for one of the oldest urban civilizations on Earth. The great cities of the Indus Valley civilization, including Mohenjo-Daro, one of the most sophisticated planned urban settlements anywhere in the ancient world, rose along this same river more than 4,000 years ago, centuries before the pyramids of Giza reached their final height. The Sindhi people, historians and now geneticists increasingly agree, represent one of the most direct living genetic and cultural threads connecting the modern subcontinent back to that ancient civilizational cradle. This is precisely what made the new genetic study so scientifically valuable, and why researchers considered it worth undertaking as the first genuinely comprehensive, genome-wide comparison of its kind. Prior genetic research on South Asia had extensively studied broad regional and caste-based populations, but the Sindhi diaspora, specifically, split cleanly by a single dramatic historical event, rather than gradually diverging over centuries of separate settlement, offered something rare, a genuinely controlled natural experiment. Here was one population, sharing deep, well-documented ancestral roots, artificially divided by a political border drawn in a matter of weeks in 1947. If genetic drift, intermarriage with new neighboring populations, and decades of separate national identity were going to meaningfully reshape a population's DNA, 80 years should have been enough time for at least the beginnings of that divergence to show up in the data. It didn't. Researchers, publishing their findings in the journal Human Genetics, used ancient DNA as a reference point to trace exactly where Sindhi ancestry actually comes from. And the results painted a remarkably consistent picture across both the Indian and Pakistani Sindhi populations sampled. Between 60 and 66% of the modern Sindhi community's genetic ancestry, the study found, traces directly back to populations genetically related to the ancient Indus Valley region itself, the same civilizational population responsible for building Mohenjo-Daro and the other great cities that once lined this river. The remaining ancestry breaks down into 2 additional layers: deep, ancient South Asian hunter-gatherer ancestry, present on the subcontinent for tens of thousands of years, and a steppe pastoralist genetic component linked to Bronze Age migrations that moved into South Asia from Central Asia sometime after the Indus Valley civilization's decline. Using statistical techniques that estimate when different ancestral populations mixed based on patterns still detectable in modern DNA, researchers calculated that this final blending of Indus Valley-related, ancient South Asian, and steppe-related ancestry occurred somewhere between 2200 and 2900 years ago, meaning the core genetic identity of the Sindhi people was already firmly established more than 2,000 years before partition, more than 2,000 years before Islam arrived in the region, and more than 2,000 years before anyone on the subcontinent had any concept of India or Pakistan as separate political entities. Here is where the real significance of this study comes into focus. When researchers compared the genetic profiles of Sindhi Hindus living in India against Sindhi Muslims still living in Sindh, Pakistan, the two populations showed overwhelming genetic continuity, the same dominant ancestral proportions, the same deep Indus Valley-related signature, the same broad genetic architecture, despite 80 years of complete political, social, and in many cases religious separation. A Sindhi family that fled to Ahmedabad in 1947, and a Sindhi family that remained in Hyderabad, Sindh, carry, in the language of population genetics, nearly the same ancestral fingerprint. A fingerprint written not in the last 80 years, but over 2,000 years ago, along the banks of a river that neither modern nation can fully claim as exclusively its own. This finding fits into a broader pattern that keeps surfacing every time researchers run this kind of direct cross-border comparison across South Asia. Earlier genetic studies comparing Punjabi populations on both sides of the border found the same thing. Jat Sikh communities in Indian Punjab and Jat communities in Pakistani Punjab remain genetically nearly indistinguishable, despite the same 80 years of separation, the same different national identities, and in many cases, the same religious divergence that followed partition. The Sindhi study now adds a second, independently documented case to that same pattern, suggesting that what researchers found in Punjab wasn't an isolated exception, but a genuine feature of how partition actually worked at the level of biology, however dramatically it worked at the level of politics, religion, and lived human experience. What makes the Sindhi case a particularly useful addition to this growing body of research is precisely how different its historical circumstances were from Punjab's. Punjab's partition-era division, while catastrophically violent, at least left substantial populations of every major community, Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim, continuing to live in some form on both sides of the new border in the years that followed, allowing for at least some degree of ongoing contact, cross-border trade in the immediate post-partition years, and shared regional dialect and custom that never fully disappeared. Sindh's Hindu exodus was more absolute, more complete, and left almost no continuing Hindu presence in the province after the initial displacement wave. If genetic divergence between separated populations was ever going to show up clearly in the data, researchers reasoned, a case as historically clean and dramatic as Sindh's, complete religious and physical separation, minimal ongoing contact, 80 years of entirely independent national development, should have been exactly the scenario most likely to reveal it. That it didn't reveal meaningful divergence, even under these more extreme conditions, makes the underlying finding considerably stronger than the earlier Punjab comparisons alone could establish. There's a particular reason the Sindhi case carries even more emotional and historical weight than some of the other cross-border comparisons researchers have conducted. Unlike Punjab, which was split roughly evenly, with large populations remaining on both sides of the new border, Sindh's Hindu population left almost entirely. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 70 and 85% of Sindh's pre-partition Hindu population fled to India in the years immediately following 1947, making Sindhi Hindus one of the only major South Asian communities to become, almost overnight, a diaspora population entirely disconnected from their ancestral homeland, with no meaningful path of return. Unlike Punjabi, Bengali, or Kashmiri communities, who at least retained large populations physically remaining in a state or province bearing their community's name, Sindhi Hindus in India rebuilt their culture and identity almost entirely from memory, oral tradition, and diaspora institutions, without the province of Sindh itself as a living, physical anchor for their community's ongoing presence. This history is precisely why the genetic finding carries such unusual weight. For a diaspora community built almost entirely around memory and displacement, a community whose members are on average now 3 to 4 generations removed from anyone who actually lived in undivided Sindh, the genetic evidence offers something history alone could not: direct, measurable, scientifically documented proof that the ancestral connection these families have maintained through language, cuisine, religious practice, and oral history for 3 generations is not simply a cultural story people tell themselves. It is a biological reality written into their DNA that predates partition by more than 2,000 years and remains clearly readable today. To appreciate what it means for a modern population to carry such a direct genetic line back to Mohenjo-Daro specifically, It helps to understand just how remarkable that ancient city actually was. At its height, roughly 4,500 years ago, Mohenjo-Daro was home to tens of thousands of residents, laid out on a precise grid system with covered drainage running beneath nearly every street. A level of urban planning that archaeologists would not see matched anywhere else in the ancient world for well over 1,000 years. The Indus Valley civilization that built it stretched across a territory larger than either ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia, trading as far as Mesopotamia itself, developing its own still undeciphered writing system, and then, for reasons still debated among archaeologists, shifting river courses, climate change, or a combination of both, declining and dispersing sometime around 1900 BCE. The people who once walked those planned streets and bathed in that city's famous Great Bath did not vanish. They dispersed across the surrounding region, and modern genetic research increasingly suggests that a substantial share of their direct descendants settled precisely where their ancestors had already been living for centuries, along the lower Indus, in the region that would eventually take the name Sindh. The human story behind the raw genetic percentages deserves its own attention because population genetics can sometimes flatten deeply personal history into abstract statistics. Sindhi Hindu families who fled in 1947 often speak of leaving behind not just homes and businesses, but entire neighborhoods built around specific temples, specific family havlis, and specific riverside ghats that had belonged to their families for generations beyond memory. Many arrived in Indian cities with nothing but what could be carried and rebuilt entire community institutions from scratch. Schools, temples, business networks, and cultural organizations dedicated explicitly to preserving Sindhi language and tradition for children who would grow up never having seen the land their grandparents called home. Organizations like the Sindhi Association and numerous community trusts across Ahmedabad, Mumbai, Pune, and Ulhasnagar have spent decades specifically working to ensure that Sindhi language instruction, classical Sindhi literature, and religious practice tied to Sufi and Hindu traditions unique to the region survive intact, even without the physical province itself as an anchor. This genetic study, in a very real sense, offers independent scientific validation of exactly the kind of continuity these community institutions have spent 3 generations trying to preserve through cultural rather than biological means. The study's authors were careful to frame their findings within the proper scientific context, and it's worth walking through exactly what that context involves. Genetic continuity across a political border doesn't mean the 2 Sindhi populations are identical in every respect, or that 80 years of separate history left no genetic trace at all. Researchers did identify some detectable differences between the Indian and Pakistani Sindhi samples, generally reflecting limited, localized admixture with neighboring populations on each side of the border. Sindhi Hindus in India showing small additional genetic contributions from surrounding Gujarati and broader Western Indian populations they settled among, and Sindhi Muslims in Pakistan showing modest additional contact with neighboring Baloch and Punjabi populations within Pakistan's borders. These differences are real, measurable, and worth documenting. But they are, by every account in the published research, minor variations layered on top of an overwhelmingly shared core ancestry. Footnotes, rather than a fundamentally different genetic story. The deeper significance of this finding extends into a broader argument the study's authors made explicitly: the scientific importance of studying diaspora communities specifically, rather than treating migration and displacement as noise to be filtered out of population genetics research. Diaspora populations like India's Sindhi Hindu community represent a kind of natural genetic time capsule, a population forcibly removed from continuous contact with their ancestral homeland, whose genetic profile therefore preserves a clearer, less diluted snapshot of what the broader Sindhi ancestral population looked like at the moment of separation, compared to populations that continued gradually mixing and evolving in place. Studying communities like this, researchers argue, offers population geneticists a uniquely valuable window into understanding the complex, layered history of South Asia as a whole, precisely because displacement, however traumatic its historical cause, effectively freezes a genetic snapshot in time. It's worth placing this finding within India and Pakistan's much larger, ongoing genetic research landscape, because the Sindhi study did not emerge in isolation. Earlier in 2026, India's National Genome India project completed sequencing of nearly 10,000 individuals from across the country, uncovering roughly 130 million genetic variants, close to a third of which had never before been documented in any global genetic database. Just weeks before the Sindhi study's publication, researchers in Pakistan released findings from an even larger effort, the Pakistan Genome Resource, a comprehensive analysis of more than 173,000 genomes, representing the single largest genetic study ever conducted on any South Asian population. That Pakistani study, led by researchers, including Columbia University's Danish Salehin, identified more than 34,000 individuals carrying naturally occurring knockout genes, people missing functional copies of specific genes entirely, offering researchers rare, real-world insight into human gene function that mouse model research has historically failed to replicate accurately. Both of these major national genome projects were explicitly framed by their researchers as correcting a long-standing and consequential gap in global science. South Asians make up nearly 25% of the entire world's population, yet represent barely 2% of the genetic data contained in the world's major genomic databases, a mismatch with direct, real consequences for how well modern medicine actually serves well over 2 billion people. Taken together, these three research efforts, India's National Genome Project, Pakistan's landmark genome resource, and this focused, community-specific Sindhi cross-border study represent a genuine turning point in how South Asia's population is understood scientifically. For most of the history of modern genetics, South Asian populations were treated, when studied at all, as a handful of broad categories, useful mainly as comparison points for research centered on European and East Asian populations. That era is visibly ending. Researchers on both sides of the India-Pakistan border are now generating the kind of large-scale, population-specific genetic data that allows for exactly the sort of precise, historically grounded finding the Sindhi study represents not a broad generalization about South Asian ancestry, but a specific, documented answer about one particular community's specific 2,000-year-old relationship to one particular stretch of river. The Sindhi cross-border study sits at the intersection of these two larger national efforts, and in some ways demonstrates exactly why this kind of granular, community-specific research matters so much. A genetic database built only from broad national categories, treating Indian and Pakistani as clean, separate genetic classifications, would have completely missed what the Sindhi study actually found. That national identity, however real and consequential in every other sense, simply does not align with the deeper ancestral genetic reality shaped by thousands of years of settlement along a specific stretch of river, and that meaningful health and ancestry research needs to account for regional and community-level history that a border was never capable of accurately capturing in the first place. None of this erases what partition actually did to the Sindhi people, or minimizes the real, lasting grief that displacement caused across 3 generations of families, now living an ocean of political history away from ancestral homes many of them will never be able to visit. Genetic continuity is not the same as historical justice, and no DNA study can undo the loss of a homeland, the destruction of centuries-old community institutions, or the trauma passed down through families who fled with almost nothing in 1947. What the science does offer is something narrower and, in its own way, quietly powerful. Confirmation, written directly into the genome, that the ancestral bond Sindhi families on both sides of the border have maintained through language, food, festival, and memory for 3 generations was never simply sentiment. It was, and remains, biological fact. A shared inheritance that a hastily drawn border, however consequential in every other respect, never actually had the power to divide. There's a wider lesson in this finding that extends beyond the Sindhi community specifically, one that touches on how modern nations tend to think about the populations displaced by their own founding. Both India and Pakistan, in their respective national narratives, have sometimes treated diaspora and refugee communities as slightly peripheral to the main national story, populations defined primarily by loss and relocation rather than by deep, continuous historical belonging to the land their ancestors actually came from. This genetic research pushes back against that framing directly. Sindhi Hindus in India are not simply refugees who arrived with nothing in 1947. They are, at the level of the genome, direct descendants of one of humanity's earliest and most sophisticated urban civilizations, carrying an ancestral connection to the Indus River Valley that predates the modern concept of India by roughly 4,000 years, and predates the modern concept of Pakistan by exactly the same span. Their displacement was real, and their loss was profound. But their belonging to that ancient river valley, the genetic evidence now confirms, was never actually erased by the act of leaving it. It's also worth noting what this study suggests for the broader field of South Asian genetics moving forward. Researchers involved in cataloging India's and Pakistan's genetic diversity have increasingly emphasized that diaspora and partition-displaced communities represent an underused resource for understanding the region's deeper population history. Precisely because these communities, frozen in a specific genetic moment by the circumstances of their displacement, sometimes preserve ancestral signals more clearly than populations that continued gradually mixing with new neighbors generation after generation in an unbroken location. As both India's Genome India project and Pakistan's Genome Resource continue expanding their sampling to include more of these historically displaced and diaspora communities, researchers expect more findings similar to the Sindhi study to emerge, each one adding another data point to the same recurring conclusion. The deepest genetic connections across South Asia continue to run along ancient regional and civilizational lines that a hastily drawn 20th century border was never actually capable of severing. For scientists, that is the result that made this study genuinely striking. Not that a single ethnic community showed shared ancestry. Researchers expected some baseline genetic continuity given the community's relatively recent, well-documented separation. What surprised them was the sheer consistency and strength of that continuity after nearly 8 decades of complete political separation, different national citizenships, and, in the case of Hindu and Muslim Sindhis specifically, different religious identities layered on top of an already complicated history. 80 years, it turns out, is simply not enough time to erase 2,000 years of shared ancestral history along the banks of the Indus, no matter how completely the political map above that history was redrawn. That is what scientists found when they finally compared Sindhi DNA in India and Pakistan. Not 2 separate peoples reshaped by 8 decades of division, but one deeply rooted population, still carrying, quietly and measurably, the same ancient genetic story their ancestors had written along the Indus River more than 2,000 years before partition ever drew a line across their homeland. Perhaps the simplest way to summarize what this research actually proves is also the most powerful. A border drawn in the summer of 1947 changed which government a Sindhi family paid taxes to, which passport they carried, which language of instruction their children learned in school, and, in many cases, which religious community they belonged to. It changed almost everything about how a Sindhi family's life would unfold going forward. What it did not change, and what the science now confirms it could never have changed, was the deeper genetic story already written into that family's body 2,000 years before any of those modern categories existed at all. Political history moves fast, and it can be brutal, arbitrary, and permanent in its consequences. Genetic history moves slowly, and in the case of the Sindhi people, it has quietly outlasted every border drawn across the land their ancestors first called home.